Hello everyone. In the last lesson we created a form template with all of the different HTML elements as well as form submission capabilities, whether synchronous or asynchronous. In this lesson we'll focus on the back end and we'll put together some pieces of code which allow to perform actions on a database. We'll be able to use it in combination with the Ajax code that we wrote in the previous lesson so that our HTML forms can read from or write to a database in real time. We're going to call it a CRUD template. CRUD is an acronym that means create, read, update, and delete, which are all the basic operations we can perform on a database. This coding library includes several files, so let's first take a look at the folder structure and make sure we understand it. After that, we're going to look at each individual file and explain the code in more detail. Do note that a lot of this code can be put together in the same files. However, the reason why we're creating this folder hierarchy is to work in a structured way and to facilitate our website's maintenance and make it more scalable. It goes without saying that if someone else was to read our code or work on our website, it would be important for the code to be readable and well organized. In the same way, if you come back to your own code at a later time, you want it to be instinctive and easy to understand. In the root folder, we have some configuration files which contain our login information and which create the connection to the database. Then we have a management folder which contains the different PHP files which would be called by Ajax either through a form or otherwise. We have a file for each type of operation: delete an element, insert or create, select all elements, select one element, and perform an update. In our subfolders, you'll also notice that we include an index.php file. That is to prevent users from navigating to the subfolder and having access to all its contents. The index file is read whenever someone opens the folder in their navigator and redirects them to the home page. The next folder is named procedure call. This is a collection of PHP classes which call some stored procedures in the database in order to perform the actual transactions. If you need more details on stored procedures and how to create them, please refer to my other series, Web Languages in a Nutshell. Onto the actual files. Let's start with config.inc.php. We named it inc because it's a file to be included in a project. Its contents will also need to be modified once we migrate our website to a different environment. For example, we'll be using one configuration file for our local development using WAMP, and then once we're ready to publish our website online, we'll be modifying the login information so that our website connects to the actual database provided by the web host. The code on top is something we'll be using in most of our files. It serves as a protection to prevent the user from accessing our file using the address bar. Once again, if needed, we redirect the user to the main index.php. What we're actually doing in this file is to define some constants with the database information which will be imported in our connection class in order to build what we call the connection string. This here is the connection class. Notice that we included the word class in the file name to better identify it. This also includes the security and redirect on top. Then we include the config file that we looked at earlier. The actual class extends PDO, which is a class built into PHP for data access. The construct function is called as soon as the class is created, and it uses the server information provided in the configuration file. The index file here is a very simple template which allows to perform the different CRUD operations. If we open it, we can see we have a link to fetch the full list of elements, a form to select one element, and so on. The file uses a basic form with post actions. However, it can easily be adapted to be asynchronous. In fact, we can reuse the Ajax template we created in the previous lesson and connect it to our CRUD files. Next comes the management folder. This contains the files that are called by the form we saw earlier. Those files serve as an intermediate between the front end and the back end. Each one will include the connection class as well as the class specific to the action that needs to be performed. Let's open select all, for example. Here you can see the include statements, include connection class, and include select class. We also define a list object, which will use the select class to call the appropriate functions and retrieve the list of elements. We'll take a closer look at the functions in a minute, but for now we can see that we're calling a set and a get function. Then we loop through the list of records and we display each one using the echo function. Then we have a back button, so we can go back to the page that contains the form or the link that took us here. The other files are roughly the same. In the case of insert, we need to know what information to insert, so we take a form post with the element's name and description, and then we call the add element function using that information as parameters. Then we display a message that confirms the element was added to the database. In the case of select one, we take in the element ID and then we look it up in the database. If the element exists, we display its details, and if it doesn't, we display an error message. Delete and update also use the element ID in order to perform the action. The procedure call folder contains the actual classes that we were importing in the management files we just looked at. Let's look at the select class. We can see that we're declaring two objects for internal use, that is, connection and user. We're assuming that the select class will always be imported alongside the connection class, and here we're creating an instance of the connection class. The user object will be used to call the procedure and return the result set. Using PDO's features, we create a prepared statement which allows to safely pass parameters to the stored procedure. For example, in the select one function, we need to use the element ID. Then to retrieve the results, we use either fetch or fetch all, which are also part of the PDO class. Let's take a look at the insert class. Here, since we don't need any output, we don't use a set and a get function like we did in the select class. We simply define an add element function which takes in the element's name and description, which are then sent to the add element stored procedure. Now, for the sake of information, let's see what the stored procedure looks like. Here we have our CRUD sample database with a procedure called add element. If we open it, we can see that there are two input parameters, element name and element description. Then we use those parameters inside of an SQL insert statement. As I mentioned, you can find some lessons on MySQL in my other series. Simply note that the stored procedures are a more secure way of accessing the database as opposed to running queries directly in the PHP code. Once again, the delete and update classes are very similar to the insert class. We take the ID as a parameter, and then we call the delete element procedure. This wraps up our overview of the CRUD template. As usual, you'll find in the description the links for all the code snippets. I'll also be included a script to create the database used as an example. I hope you benefited from this. Thank you for watching and see you in the next lesson.